Welcome to Navigating Receiverships, a podcast from the Commercial Receivers Association focused on building a better understanding of what brings companies into receivership, what happens in receivership, what makes them unique, some alternatives to receiverships, and ultimately, what happens to the business as the receivership is closed out. I'm one of your hosts, Eric Morcheski, CRA board member and CEO of Nimble Strategies. Welcome to Navigating Receiverships. I'm here today with Peter Davis, Senior Managing Director of JS Held, based in Phoenix, Arizona. Peter, thank you so much for joining us today. This is going to be a great conversation.
Thanks, Eric. Happy to be here.
Why don't we jump right in? Will you give our listeners a little bit about your background in case they don't know you?
Yes, I'm a CPA by training. I hold 6 different credentials now, including the ABV, the CFF, which if you don't know those are through the AICPA accreditation in business valuation and certified in financial forensics. I'm also a certified fraud examiner, certified turnaround professional, and a certified insolvency and restructuring advisor. I have an MBA from Arizona State University. That's all the stuff that I usually talk about when I'm testifying at court. So I apologize, jump into that from autopilot, but I ran a practice. I actually worked overseas for a number of years for KPMG in Germany, and then came back to the States and started a consulting firm. I had worked at Navigant and PwC also kind of in between there, but I started Simon Consulting based out of Phoenix. And we did a variety of work, a mix of receivership work. And at this point in my career, I think I've been a receiver almost 70 times. And then also did expert witness work on complex financial situations. So think fraud investigations, forensic accountings. Those two skill sets get mixed together often and brought together in receiverships, financial type receiverships, which I think we're going to be talking a little bit about today. About 4 years ago, I sold my practice to JS Held, which is where I'm at now. And I'm a senior managing director with JS Held. I lead a group here at the firm, and I really enjoy what I do, and I'm really looking forward to sharing some information and knowledge with everyone about the projects that I work on.
So
Yeah.
go ahead and jump in a little bit to maybe who JS Held is and then kind of some of the projects you work on.
Yeah. Okay, perfect. That's what I was going to do. So JS Held, we're about 2,000 employees worldwide. The firm got its start in the construction advisory, 9/11, that type of thing, and got into restructuring and turnaround receivership with the acquisition of my firm. We've acquired some 70 firms over 7-8 years. So we've grown tremendously. We're now $500 million in revenues, and we're private equity held, and we're growing, at a tremendous rate. What's great about the firm, we have a very deep bench of experts, scientific, technical experts from all different fields, not just construction and forensic accounting. I've skipped past so many of the talented areas contained within JS Held, such as valuing equipment, individuals who are toxicologists or epidemiologists. And believe it or not, like a lot of our work, we tap into those individuals. So when we have cannabis situations, we can bring our food experts. If you have a kitchen facility that you're operating, making sure we're compliant with appropriate regulations and best practices. I have a case involving a complex trade secret issue. We have top, intellectual property experts here, and some of the trade secrets involve food type trade secrets, and we have food experts, PhDs in food technology type backgrounds. And then just the oddest of situations have come up where we've needed someone who's an expert in cell phone tower locations, and we have one, or coal mines. We have an expert on coal mines and coal mine equipment and those sorts of things. So I'm very fortunate to be at a firm with such a diverse group, because we can really help our clients solve these complex situations we get into, or all the better with this huge depth. We also have a very collaborative culture that invites sharing of information, ideas, clients. It's not a really elbowy place to work. It's a great environment to foster the intellectual environment that I think a lot of us enjoy, and train the next generation of professionals, which we're doing. As far as work and projects, the receivership work I've done falls into some different buckets. A lot of them are, many cases, come typically through like the commercial litigation department of a law firm where they're dealing with a deadlock issue. And there's a concern about dissipation of assets, and we'll be appointed as a neutral receiver. In some of those cases, we've elected to have the shareholders who are also in management not participate in management, sit on the sidelines, because the tension caused by having the continual participation of them can draw the company to its knees and hurt their own best interests. So we're often a referee making careful decisions in the company's best interest and holding things together while a dispute is adjudicated in a state court or federal court setting. And the goal is to return the company to the successful shareholder in as good, if not better, form than we took it on. There are costs to doing that, but what we have done in many of those cases is taken an active role in the beginning and become more of a monitor towards the mid to back end of the case, once you situate things in a way that it can operate. So that keeps the fee cost, the expense of doing something like this less, where there's individuals there who are capable of running the company, which is almost always the case. In one case, I selected one of the parties in the litigation to run the company, which is somewhat controversial to do, but if there's compelling reasons to do so. And the other side was invited to monitor what they were doing, so that there was a way to put some checks and balance in place. And we did. It was a very, very hotly disputed case. So even though those efforts were attempted by me, it wasn't able to reduce the acrimony in the dispute and the allegations and that sort of thing. But we managed through the process. We were in that case for 2 or 3 years. And I remember being crossed by the lawyer for the out shareholder. And he wasn't even aware that we had invited his client into the company to participate and monitor and things like that. So sometimes these are very difficult disputes where the degree of acrimony is so deep that we have to have regular check-ins with our judge and make sure we're getting cover in the process of how we're making decisions, run through, notice everything to the court. Anyways, that's a big area of work for us, are these deadlock type cases. Another area of work is lenders who have a default under their loan agreements, and oftentimes it's taking possession of the collateral and winding the company down and selling it. Unfortunately, many of those cases do result in a liquidation type sale. Many of the companies that are in that position are often they're too far gone by the time a receiver is getting appointed, and it really is just protecting the collateral for the lender and getting a sale done. Now, in some cases, we've been able to operate those and sold them as operating concerns, which is great because we get to preserve some employment and we get to help maximize the recovery. But they're not all like that. And some of the cost structures or business models are so flawed that there isn't really a way to save it or to protect creditors in that process, that by running the company, continuing to run it, we'd incur more debts, and that wouldn't put the creditors or equity in a better position at the end. So to make some tough calls in those situations. Another area of work are federal and state regulators who bring cases. And we're going to talk about one of those today, but often you hear about SEC receiverships. They also do monitorships and distribution agents. You hear about FTC receiverships. And then state regulators, you have state securities agencies, state insurance agencies. So you have a number of state regulators. You have state regulators of education, state boards of education, who have abilities under statute and also through courts of equity to bring receiverships as a way to preserve and protect assets for the benefit of victims of fraud, which is often the case. In those cases, the receiver will, go to work to collect the assets, which is often litigation claims, and then develop plans to repay victims of the fraud and work closely with the regulators, but also, all those involved in the case to ensure, an equitable result for, the victims of the fraud. In the cases of like more regulated, business enterprises such as utilities, for example, there was a utility in Arizona that was put into receivership, but also you have public school districts, which we're going to talk about, and then insurance companies. You get a lot of insurance companies that fail and receivers get appointed to unwind them. Sometimes the receiver is actually an employee of the state, but they appoint a deputy receiver, so that is a more unique role. So that's generally my background. And the forensic accounting comes in handy, that skill set, in all of these cases, because we can develop a very clear idea, very rigorous accounting that's performed that gives the court and the parties a sense of where things are at, and that can invite settlement and resolution. It can also be challenged by the parties, but because we're experts in forensic accounting, our analysis is often, honed for a trial. It's developed to withstand cross-examination and an opposing expert's analysis of it. And if we're wrong, we'll sort that out. If there's documents we didn't have, we will, go in and get the right answer. And that's our end of game objective. And by doing that, it helps the parties to have more certainty. And with that certainty, they're more willing to reach a resolution. So I want to switch now to talking about public school. Is that okay with you, Eric? That we'll jump right in?
That's where we're headed with all of this, right? So I think it's kind of a fascinating topic because it is being brought up more and more by media, whether it's the newspapers, whether it's television stations, but we're seeing this as a pretty common theme across the country that school districts are considering what their options are when there's poor management or whether there's an issue that arises within the district, whether they should consider appointing a receiver. And most of this is already in statute that they have the ability to appoint it, but just because they have the ability to do it doesn't mean they necessarily want to do it right away. So talk us through a little bit about what you've seen with why school districts are being brought into receivership. Let's start with kind of what some of the problems were that you were seeing that are forcing these states to pick up the phone and call you.
Well, first, we have to take a step back a little bit, that the receiverships that happen for public schools, which are they're basically government entities. They're funded by tax dollars and grants and federal monies as well, that they're monitored and overseen by state boards of education. They're also monitored and overseen by their own governing board, which is an elected body. What states have done is states have passed statutes that allow for the appointment of a receiver. So it's under statute that a receiver could be appointed in these situations. And that receiver is not appointed through a court like we typically see, but rather through the state board of education. There is a process by which receivers are vetted through a contract, a government contract, effectively, that's submitted. The government will solicit requests for proposal, and receiver candidates will apply. And it's not for necessarily a specific district, but more for generally being on the list, of receivers. And so by applying and demonstrating the expertise and experience in turning around, financially distressed districts, then you essentially you're on this list. And then when a school has a challenge, then that they will turn to those approved receivers, who've been through this RFP process. As far as the reasons for districts to go into receivership, we have had districts who have voluntarily wanted to be in receivership. They're not all that way. With public education at the state level, there's very much a political tension that we've noticed, where you have, it's a very large expenditure for state budgets, probably one of their largest. And they have a requirement constitutionally to educate children in their state, typically. So, and I'm mostly referencing Arizona, where we've done these public schools. So the state can't get out of the responsibility, right? They have to educate kids. And the question is, how do they do that, and how do they do that in a cost-effective way? And we've heard a lot of political discourse about, this state spends very little on education, this state spends a lot, and there's tension politically between governors and state legislatures related to this. So you're thrust into the mix of that as a receiver. Just being aware generally of that is important. And you're also limited by what the law allows. The law will state how much per child you can get for funding. And it will have a number of other technical restrictions in terms of how you measure a child who's been there part of the year but not the entire year, or a kid who's missing a lot of days of school, and all of those things. And then the sources of funds can be varied and different. You have what's called M&O, which is maintenance and operations, and then you have federal grants, Title I. You've got your bus system, which operates under a different function. You've got the lunch system. You have all the various other functionalities, including like technology expenses for the school, which get paid through, I think, a federal tax on your cell phone bill. It's called E-rate. So you've got all these sources of dollars coming in. And schools have had, I think, two types of problems, two different types that we've seen. Most of them are the first type, which is a budget problem. And that's where they're budgeted and allocated a certain amount of spending per child every year based on the average days that child is actually in the classroom. And if you have either what you see now, declining enrollment, so that's a major factor. But you also have schools that just are spending more than they should, period. You have green grass, perfect lawns, wonderful bus systems, brand new buses, and all that type of thing. But they're overspending their budget, by twice of what they should, or 25 or 30%. And if they do that 2 years in a row, they start to have problems. What happens at the state is they're going to say, if you overspent your budget in year one, you need to underspend it in year two by that same amount. So if you have a big overspend, then you're underspending. The next year has to be so deep. Your cut has to be so deep to break even that you can't even perform your basic services. It's that sort of dilemma that brings a receiver in. So a big snafu happens. It could be things out of their control, but most of the cases I've seen are in their control. Mismanaging overtime, mismanaging dollar allocation, being small districts, but having your own bus barn and your own bus maintenance crew and all these expensive services you're trying to do on your own, when what you could do is just partner with your neighboring district and have them do it. They're twice, 3 times your size, and they can manage those costs much more efficiently than you could do it yourself. So there's all these things that happen that cause these budgets to balloon. And then what we do is get creative and find ways to bring that budget down. And almost every time without affecting education, in fact, improving it, because there's more certainty and clarity. The other area of problems you have is on cash side, where districts fail to apply for, lack the technical expertise on how to apply for some of the complex grants, E-rate monies, and other dollars they're otherwise entitled to. You just don't get it. And so because they don't get the money, they don't apply for it, they don't pursue it, there's that lack of cash in their account. And so while they may be close to budget, or within reasonable budget, they may just not have the liquidity, the cash to fund their operations. The cash funding comes through the county treasurer, and county treasurers don't like spending money that's not theirs. That's not there. They're essentially borrowing money to fund that district. And so there's an accountability through the treasurer's office, which is helpful on public schools. So those are the two sort of pathways, I'd say, that result in receivership. And they're governed by statute, like an automatic receiver. And also the auditor general gets involved as well. In Arizona, it's interesting, our auditor general actually has a chart that predicts which districts will go in receivership. So they're getting all their financials, because all the districts have to have an audit done. And then they send their financials to the auditor general, they review them. And, depending on those financial results, you can see the districts that are financially distressed and challenging. What's fascinating to me is you can get two neighboring districts and one doing phenomenally well and one doing horrible. And it really comes down to management. It comes down to the senior leadership of the district and their decisions. You have typically two leaders at the district responsible for the financial affairs, the superintendent and the business manager. And oftentimes the school district budgets are tens of millions of dollars. These are massive budget, $50, $100 million budgets. But your business managers are individuals who are not making anywhere near what a CFO, for example, would make at a company with equivalent size revenue. So they're not necessarily CPAs. They don't necessarily have all that training. And on a smaller district, you can probably get away with that. On a bigger district, as things get complex, if that person, that business manager / CFO doesn't have the acumen for this, it can be problematic. In the district that we're working on right now, Isaac, as student enrollment was going down, administrative overhead costs were going up. That should never happen. It created a cash crunch, a budget crunch that is a massive, massive hill to undo. And by the way, that's another thought, is the sooner that a district can react, the better off they are, because you're giving us, the hole isn't as deep to dig out of and gives us a lot more options. So I think we're going to see a lot more districts who have declining enrollment, who are going to have to look at closing buildings, reducing administrative staff, and the like. There is a fix, there is a remedy for it, but they should be, hopefully proactive. If they're not, they could end up in receivership.
So you make me a little bit curious, because there are certain states where I see a lot of receiverships for education, for public school systems, or at least a lot of potential receiverships for public school systems. But living in Missouri, I can't remember ever seeing one. And so I'm wondering if that's not part of Missouri's state remedies, or what the scenario is there. You've got me curious enough to look it up after our conversation here. But when you're going through all of these things, you touched a little bit on the business manager and the superintendent are really making a big difference. But you also then touched on, as you've kind of come through these, you've actually been able to increase the level of education while decreasing costs. What are you doing? Because obviously, if you've come in and you found there's a good superintendent, a good business manager, you want to keep them in place, you want to keep them happy. But what are you doing to, I mean, in any other industry, you'd say increase the product or service value while decreasing the cost of goods sold. What are you doing to make that happen?
Well, I don't think we've had a district where the superintendent and business manager remained in place.
Okay.
And it's unfortunate, but I think that receivership, like the typical receiverships we see, is a bit of a last resort. It's like your desperate move. You have some concerns. So by the time it gets to us, that it's demonstrative that leadership has failed in some way. And as we dig into where that failure lies, often is there is a mismanagement, a financial mismanagement aspect of the reasons that they're in receivership. Like, I've not found that to be disconnected, but rather connected every time. Financial mismanagement, and we're in receivership. In fact, it's one of the bases to put an entity in receivership is financial mismanagement. Now, what you have a lot of really good people. Like, teachers are one of the most caring and committed groups. In Isaac, 3-4 weeks ago, we were unable to pay teachers because we did not get a loan in time to fix the district. The loan did not come in. They remained committed and teaching our kids for 3 days without certainty on compensation. And when we came through, they came through as well. And we did come through for them. So they were all paid, but it was late. It is, I think, an absolute privilege to work in this space because of the commitment of the teachers to their students. And so getting back to your question of what do we do to improve education in these situations, we're a bunch of CPA types. We're not really, no, we don't know anything about really teaching kids, but we know that the uncertainty that can come and the distraction that comes when you have a district not doing great. And you get all kinds of tensions. We haven't talked a lot about the governing board. Governing board is an elected body, and they supervise the superintendent and the business manager as a board would, right? And they're fed information, though, from the business manager and superintendent as well. And some boards, they vary on their sophistication level. And in my experience, your public school districts are not the most sophisticated boards typically. They're caring parents who may not have business sophistication. They may have sophistication on education or on, which is great, but maybe not on the business side or on the financial side. Just to take a pause here for a sec, because I'm going to get back to your question of like, what do we do to redirect dollars in the classroom? I want to go through some of the powers you have as a receiver, because those powers are not given to you like through a court order, but rather through a statute. So the statute says that we can reorganize the district's finances and budgets. So in other words, update the budgets, redo them, and we often have to do that. We can terminate employees. It's a big deal, including the superintendent business manager. They often have contracts. You have to deal with that, like they're one-year contracts, but we can terminate them. We can override decisions by the governing board. That's a big deal. Remember, this governing board is elected, and here receivers appointed by the State Board of Education can override the elected body. It's an interesting constitutional issue that we've never had to try, but we view that particular power very cautiously and try to use persuasion and get the board on our side to work with us. We're not coming in there with a heavy hammer, a heavy hand and such. Sometimes we have to, and sometimes we have to override, and I'll talk to you a little bit about some of those situations, particularly in Colorado City. We'll supervise the day-to-day activities. We have to submit reports to the State Board of Education, including a 120-day report. That's like the big report. So you've got this 120 days, and then you got to put this report together. What's your restructuring plan? How are you fixing this district? And it'll include, financial timelines and financial improvement plans. Okay, so you've got all these powers as a receiver. And how do you then fix a district? How do you then financially get the district back in line, that they're within budget, that they have the cash they need, and that they can repay the mess, the financial overspending that happened in the past? So you have to do all of those pieces. How do you do that? Well, the first step is a careful evaluation of where the spending has been going. In districts where they have a declining enrollment, they probably have, and in the case of Isaac, they have way too much overhead, way too much administrative staff for the number of students they have. So there's a downsizing that has to happen. And then we have to go through a process of determining, where do we downsize and how do we make this fit right? Other cost efficiencies that we can review. Overtime. There's often excessive overtime built into these budgets, maybe even overtime abuse. And so we'll go in and ban overtime or require approval of overtime at a more senior level so that we really limit that cost. I've saved millions of dollars in districts by just addressing overtime. Then we can look for other cost efficiencies that relate to, say, bus services that the district provides. Some districts are relatively small and will have their own bus barn, bus repair station, technicians, and such. There's a cost to all of that. And if you're running, 10 or 15 buses, can you really justify having your own bus barn and a whole staff of people dedicated to those buses? Is it more cost efficient to enter into an intergovernmental agreement with your neighboring district, which is 2 or 3 times your size, and use their bus barn? Maybe even have them take over your entire busing service and pay them the cost. And so small districts, which are more vulnerable to receivership because they have less dollars overall, and so blips or overspends are harder to fix and cover, and they're just not as efficient, generally speaking. If they haven't already entered into creative joint projects or joint cost sharing, they'll end up with higher higher cost structures that they're carrying year over year over year. And so they have less wiggle room. So the point is entering into intergovernmental agreements for many of the services that districts provide. Special ed is very expensive to provide, very expensive. Working with neighboring districts, evaluating those costs, evaluating the level of services being provided, are they appropriate? There's also additional monies available from the federal government. We talked about a little bit Title I, I mentioned. There's Atlas funds, and there's other funds available to help improve educational quality in the classroom. Making sure those dollars are tapped into. There's all sorts of volunteer teacher organizations or Teach for America type programs where you get these youthful, idealistic teachers in the classroom who can bring a whole new energy to the school. So tapping into those resources as well. There's just so much the state and its community wants to do to see education. People want to see our schools do well. We had a district where the NFL football team was giving donations to the district, tickets and things like that. Those were meant for the poorest kids at the district. Well, turns out district employees were selling those tickets on eBay or on Craigslist or whatever, and making the money on the side. I mean, that's the type of abuse. So you're not getting the dollars in where they should go. You're getting that stuff flowing out the back door. The same with school supplies. We've seen where there's theft, people trying to, taking the excess supplies, extra ordering, and then turning around and selling it on the side. In Colorado City, we saw about 20 employees that had full-time jobs elsewhere and were also employed at the district. If you don't know, Colorado City is located in kind of behind the Grand Canyon in a very remote area of Arizona. And it's where Warren Jeff's polygamous community is located. Jeff didn't allow his children, his community's children, to go to the public school, but he allowed them to work there. And because they had the voting majority, they controlled the district through the governing board, and they employed 18 people to run a district that only educated about 400 kids. You don't need 18 people to run a district. This is the administrative office. You need 3 or 4 to run a district that size. And so there was just excess employment. And as I mentioned, all 18 of these employees had full-time jobs elsewhere. And so they were claiming, they told me, oh, we work double shifts. I mean, it was clearly, financial abuse. They had also used the district's money to buy an airplane and claimed they needed it, for the school district. Again, you're dealing with a 400-person school. You mentioned, Eric, your question about, does Missouri have the law? Well, Arizona did not have a receivership statute before Warren Jeffs started to take over the district and use it as a financial tool to support his people, effectively financially abusing, the state by forcing all these employees, controlling the governing board, and doing what he was doing. And so the state passed a statute that allowed receiverships, and now that's become an effective tool where you're taking the worst performing districts and saying, hey, let's get those before it gets worse, So I really recommend, if you don't have a statute like that in your state, you talk to your legislators and you look at getting a statute mirroring other states. It really, like I said, we've reduced the cost, so we're saving taxpayer money, and we're doing right by the kids because we're improving the education. We're giving the teachers certainty and clarity. We're getting some ineffective leadership out. We're bringing in more effective leadership. And the school district goes on and does great. There's a lot of money available for schools from federal grants, from nonprofits, from the state, of course, that there's plenty of dollars available there. It's just a question of how you allocate those dollars. Because in all these school district fixes, we've reduced their budget going forward because we had to in order to repay the excesses of the past. In all of those cases, even with a reduced budget, education improves because we give clarity to the teachers, we give clarity to the leadership of the school. We put the dollars in the classroom, and we look for all those other cost efficiencies that we can find. I don't know if I fully answered your question. I think I kind of navigated a little bit, but
you answered it, and I'm going to kind of ask you a leading question here. But aside from the Warren Jeffs case, which was its own unique entity, how long are these receivership appointments lasting for you when you're stepping in?
Yeah, so there's actually statute that sets forth when the receiver ends.
Mhm.
And if I recall, I'm going from memory, but it's at the point in time where the repayment plan is certain. And there's a measurement. We talked about the overspend, right? Once you have clarity on being able to repay that money
Mhm.
and a plan set forth that's measurable and doable, and then you have, I think there's a requirement that you've done it in fact for 1 year or 2 years. I can't remember if it's 1 or 2 years, then you're out. So in the cases that we've had, the state gives you 2 years to repay a budget overspend. But in our cases, we've gone to the legislature and asked for 5 years. Because if we have 5 years to repay, it's not as, many of these cases, the hole is pretty deep, right? And if you try to repay it over 2 years, you're going to dig so deep in your budget. We're talking like 25, 40% cuts in the budget, 25 to 40%. That's not going to work. You can do 15, 20% possibly, and so that's if we can reduce the hit to the district as much as possible and pay that gradually over time. So I think I'd say the average is about 2 years.
Mhm.
The first 2 months are pretty involved. There's a cost. The receiver costs are a little higher those first 2 months. And I should mention these are all being done at a discounted hourly rate, given that it's government and it's education. So we've really tried to bring our rate down to a level that's affordable for the districts, but gives us at least, fair compensation, reasonable compensation for what we're doing. After those first couple months, what we will do is make sure we've lined up an interim business manager, an interim superintendent. And there are some really great retired, semi-retired business managers and superintendents out there. They're just so grateful to have them out there in the community who are willing to jump in and they fix it. They know this stuff like the back of their hand. They do a phenomenal job. And they're working at the cost of the district rather than, at our higher hourly rates. And they do an amazing job of just getting the ship righted and cleaned up going forward. So very lucky to have that community out there. And then what we're doing is monitoring, and our costs go drastically down. And we're just monitoring it as the district repays debts and works through the budget issues going forward. It's just really the first month or two that it's kind of crazy.
So, being though that you're in for a year or two, one thing that obviously has to come up is employee retention, teacher retention. How are you seeing people react? Like, how are you seeing the teachers react to the idea of being employed at a school that's in receivership? Because there is a bunch of other school districts out there, a bunch of other options for them, and there's always a shortage of quality teachers, right? So, is that having a factor for you?
Yeah, my sense is there's been relief because they sensed there was a problem before, and
Mhm.
now they see that we're on track. There's a couple months of uncertainty, that crazy couple months while we sort through numbers. It depends how bad it is. Isaac's in bad shape, this new one, Isaac,
Mhm.
and it's big. But we work with the principals and the people who are, working with the teachers. And I personally have met with dozens of teachers. We're an open book and they know we're doing our job and we are asking them to do their job. And
Mhm.
I don't think I've met a more dedicated group of people in my career than the teachers in our public education system, public and private, that I've met over my lifetime. So
That's great to hear.
yeah,
Uh,
we give them the certainty, they do great.
so kind of trying to kind of bring this to wrap up, what should others take away from your experience with all these public school systems that have gone through this?
Well, I think they need our expertise. If you're a financial receiver, you have a financial turnaround background, I'd encourage you to look at ways you can help in the community, maybe serving on a board, helping to pass a statute for receivership, or even serving as a receiver and just looking at it, because these kids, they deserve a fair shake in life at that age, and it's all our job to help our communities have the best education for those kids. So that would be my main takeaway, because at the end of the day, that's really what we're all doing in these school receiverships.
Well, thank you so much for your time today, Peter. I know this is an interesting topic that's coming up more and more. So having someone with your experience and background doing these several times now, that you can speak to not just even one instance, but several instances, and what you're seeing is really helpful to, our listeners, and especially hopefully thank you from the school districts and from the kids that are going through it all.
Thanks, Eric. My pleasure. Thanks for allowing me to be a part of this.
Yeah. Thanks so much, Peter. Have a
Bye-bye.
good one. Thank you for joining Navigating Receiverships, brought to you by the Commercial Receivers Association. Find more information at commercialreceiver.org and catch every Navigating Receiverships podcast by subscribing through your favorite platform today.